Well, thank you, Dr. Stewart, for those kind words. To start with, can you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone. Dr. Stewart is actually the lead, the co-PI for the Ontario NEIHR, and she organized sub-themes of priorities all to address mental health. And I'm the theme lead for the healing from trauma and reducing addictions. So our team, doctors Ferguson, Ristoul, and myself, decided one of the tangible outcomes we could do to advance First Nation, Métis, Indigenous health is really look at how our world paradigms are very different, our worldview and culture. So we're going to talk about PIHTIKWE. And PIHTIKWE means welcome, come in. It's a Cree word, inviting you to come in and to visit with us. So I'm just having a bit of a technical issue here. It's not advancing. So if you just bear with me for a moment. So we're just going to introduce our team and everybody will introduce themselves. So Dr. Ferguson.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Deb, for the smudge and for the smoke that I could see on the screen with Etsy and others. I tried to virtually transport myself to Anishinaabeg territory. I'm another Anishinaabeg living in BC on West Bank First Nation, to be specific. I hold a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Health, Healing, and Community Revitalization, recovering from trauma. I'm an associate professor as well in Indigenous Studies and Psychology at UBC Okanagan, and I'm also a registered psychologist. My people live in Sandy Bay Ojibwe First Nation, Treaty 1 territory. I have family all throughout the Manitoba area. My family in life comes from Seabird Island First Nation, Stalo Nation, where I lived for a number of years, grew up and attended school, and I'm a proud graduate of Indian Control of Indian Education Band School. So that's me.
I'm Holly Graham. I'm a member of Thunshall First Nation, Besu Oasis, and I hold an Indigenous Research Chair in Nursing. And I initially started and still am a registered nurse and then advanced into mental health. Most of my family is and still lives around Thunderchild. My mother was a fluent Cree speaker. Unfortunately, I don't speak Cree, but was fortunate enough to be raised in many of our cultural activities and certainly in spirituality. So I look forward to spending the next hour with everyone.
Ani Bojo Wapsquans Dijnakas Magizi Dodam Kikanda Donjba Nishnabekwe Endao Bendigo Saking. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Brenda Restoul. I'm a registered psychologist in Ontario. I'm a member of Dokis First Nation in the Robinson Huron Treaty in Northeastern Ontario. And I'm also the CEO of First Peoples Wellness Circle, an Indigenous-led organization that supports the mental wellness workforce in First Nations communities. And like Alanis, I too am a graduate of Ban Run School and actually an Indian Day Scholar. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And I also like to take the opportunity to introduce our elder who supported this project. Luana Harper Shirt is the daughter to Elder Pauline Shirtbaugh and Vern Harper Baugh. She is a respected knowledge keeper in the Toronto and Barrie area and does many amazing things. She's an artist, a writer, an educator, a herbalist, and a ceremonialist. And she gives amazing guidance in the work that many people do in our communities. So, this podcast, as Holly mentioned at the beginning, was something that as a group we decided was a way that we could have an opportunity to explore what healing from trauma looked like and how addressing trauma issues could support reducing addictions. As such, we're of course part of the NEIHR here. And for those of you who are joining not part of the NEIHR, the Ontario NEIHR is addressing the mental health crisis affecting Indigenous people by shifting from Western biomedical models to looking at culturally culturally safe and strengths-based approaches that are rooted in our culture, our traditions, our governance, and our practices and ways of being, doing, and knowing. So why does this matter? As we were having lots of discussions, one of the things we acknowledged was, as Indigenous people, we continue to struggle with alarmingly high rates of all sorts of challenges and illnesses, both in health and mental health and in addictions. And we know that much of that is attributed to the ongoing and lasting impacts of colonization and colonialism that affects us and our people even to this day. And that as a result of that, we continue to experience many types of historical and systemic barriers, whether that's equitable access to services, ensuring that we are treated with equity and inclusion, so reducing and eliminating racism and discrimination, and the acknowledgement of non-Indigenous people about the significance of Indigenous knowledge that has been put aside and really ignored for so long, that those have all impacted our health and well-being. And so our work as individual psychologists and as Indigenous professionals across this country, many of us, we acknowledge, seek to find ways to ensure that our people have access to culturally relevant and safe services that support them to address mental health and addictions challenges. That also we need to be thinking about, how do we sustain these and how do we ensure that we thrive as people? And so much of the podcast was exploring not so much the deficits based, although it was acknowledging it, but more so to think about what are the strategies and ways that we are working to support mental wellness in our communities.
So as Dr. Bastil has shared, we just really created these podcasts as a way to highlight our leaders who have been forging ahead and creating these pathways that many of us have been fortunate to kind of fall in line or become a part of at some point in our careers, and to really start mobilizing in a meaningful way and an accessible way that anybody could just listen, pick it up versus, reading a paper about it. And so we just really wanted to look at different perspectives and experiences and looking at what was working, what were some of the challenges. And we were really interested in the personal experiences of these First Nation primarily and Métis psychologists and what they were taking from their experiences with seeing clients and their recommendations. And then also looking at the systems of care, like how is this impacting either positively and negatively Indigenous health and well-being. So before we talk a little bit more about kind of the analysis and what we found out, Dr. Ferguson put together a synthesis of season 1. So we're working on season 2 and it's being released, I think starting probably within a month, we'll have several podcasts coming out. But from season 1, we had 9 speakers. And so this is about a 4-minute clip. And Shanti's going to play this for all of you, and then we'll kind of get a little bit more in terms of how we went about the process and some of the learnings. So we will need somehow to figure out if everyone's hearing the video the way we're hearing it. So Shanti, I'll leave that to you to ensure that
Perfect.
the audio is working and the music.
Okay, so it should all work. If it doesn't, just speak up and we can try again, but everything should work fine.
A kid walks in, there should just be a table with nothing on it except for a pencil and maybe a timer. The way I do it is I have plates and cup and food waiting, and I usually have like a smudge bowl, and if the child wants to use like a mortar and pestle to prepare the medicine themselves, the weight of the rock is very calming for them, and then also the crushing part is helpful, and the smells from the medicine just calm your central nervous system.
We have to stop perpetuating this idea that because it works for a certain population, it's automatically going to work for us. Let's use this Western-based practice, but let's talk about how you understand it from your culture. And so now we're going to dress it up with beads and feathers and say, there's an adapted culturally based practice. Culturally based means we start from culture first. We have those conversations with community and understand what's meaningful to them.
Mental illness is normal reaction to abnormal situations. So people develop some pretty creative coping strategies, which mainstream psychology sees as illness or as pathological. With that illness-based model, you're looking at how a person failed in their health. Whereas I think a more Indigenous approach is to emphasize what that person is capable of becoming. Everything they need is within them already. They're born with those. You don't lose those gifts, those abilities. It's reclaiming them.
I sometimes say I started getting in far fewer fights when I stopped walking around with my fists up. Once I began to see the people within the system not being the system, right? The people within the system are not the system. The people in the system are constrained by a lot of things, but really having as many of those conversations as we can to bring that community-based cultural knowledge to those tables, I think that's one thing that we can be doing.
I remember in Penitang, the biggest thing that was given to me was being able to smudge. And smudging is such a small thing in our healing. One of the arguments I had one time was when we were talking about this in the team meeting. I said, well, if a chief of psychiatry came to my reserve and our community told him he could only administer aspirins, then he would understand what I'm dealing with here and being told I can only smudge.
The things that we do in the circles that John and I have been part of with Feather Carriers Leadership for Life Promotion have been focused on actually helping people to know where they come from, know who they are, understand why they're here, and then see and understand where they're going. What happens with colonization is it's made it extremely difficult for people to answer those questions.
We've shown that things like feelings of community belonging, feelings of cultural pride, those seem to protect against the negative effects of having a parent who enters residential school, or we've also shown how it's protected against the negative effects of perceptions of discrimination, of bullying in communities. Our identities and having positive identities is really important for human health and wellness.
So things I'm telling you right now that are very traditional Indigenous things I think should be part of every psychologist's toolbox. Running, dancing, singing, laughter, being in a collectivist group. Those kinds of things are very fundamental to our well-being. And those are things that were all colonized. Music was taken away, drumming was taken away, singing was taken away, our movement was taken away. Even our sleep habits were taken away.
I actually really discourage our people to go into psychology because I don't actually think that the discipline of psychology has anything to offer our people because it's not a hospitable environment for training. I know from my own experience, it's not a hospitable environment for practice. The power of what I do as a psychologist is really in psychotherapy, which you don't need to go into psychology proper to do that. So if you want to do therapy and you help our people, I recommend going into social work or maybe doing a professional degree in counseling that's going to give you some of those applied skills that you need, because I think the discipline of psychology is quite harmful to our people as students as well as professionals.
Okay, so the first voice that you heard in that series of clips was from Dr. Melanie Nelson, and she's an assistant professor in school psychology at UBC Vancouver. I actually supervised her pre-doctoral internship when she was at Simon Fraser and I was at Simon Fraser. So she's kind of now a colleague. All of these guests became our colleagues as we visited with them. And this is a quote from that was created by Brenda's organization and her research team to kind of represent some of the main analysis that she provided around the systems of care, getting funding mental health or psychological services above Indigenous approaches to healing, because psychological services are still a part of health structures, whereas our own Indigenous approaches are less so or are not. And she identified that as a big barrier, and that we also lost a lot of our healers with changes due to the Indian Act when we weren't allowed to practice ceremony anymore. So she thought that if something was really in dire need, is to try to get whatever knowledge can emerge from communities. And this was a really unique finding. And if I'm allowed to add my interpretation to this, and something that's kind of happened in conversation with Brenda as well, is when we talk with other First Nations people who practice psychology, but are also have living, vital, ongoing, sincere kinship connections within their own communities, they tend to put their responsibilities towards their communities first, above their responsibilities to their practice of psychology. Not to say that they don't take their role of being a psychologist seriously. They do. They absolutely do. But there's a qualitative difference when we visit with a First Nations psychologist who um, has actual, like, real literal and figurative skin in the game. Like, it will impact them if their communities heal and recover directly because they're embedded within that community. And we all stand to benefit if our people can heal. And then psychology, the practice of psychology, can become a tool. Whereas sometimes in what we've seen, in our field, in our work as psychologists, as people will use their Indigenous identity as a tool to leverage themselves and their careers as psychologists first above community members. And I think that if you listen to Dr. Melanie Nelson's interview, you will see and hear her real sincere commitments to inclusive education, to school psychology practice, particularly within the nation where she works, which is Squamish First Nation in North Vancouver. Next.
You'll also hear from Dr. Carol Hopkins. She is a trained social worker, and she's the CEO of Thunderbird Partnership Foundation. What makes Carol unique is that she has also spent some time thinking about her training culturally. And she has quite the story, but what she shares is that she is a fifth or sixth level Medeawin person, and leads as the chief for the water in the Medeawin Society. And in all of her learning and involvement with the Medeawin Society, we can say that if we started to compare our cultural education that we receive, for Carol, she would be considered as having a PhD in culture. And so our conversation with her was very much around why culture and culturally based practices are critical to well-being. She has led the treatment centers, Youth Solvent Abuse Treatment Center, before becoming the CEO of Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and now works to support treatment centers both at the youth level and at the adult level, in terms of ensuring well-being of our people. And so what she has shared is that we need to claim what we know. We need to claim what is ours, and that is our knowledge that has been passed on, that spirit-based knowledge that comes to us through our ancestors, that comes to us through our relatives, and the acknowledgement and recognition of being part of creation. And that as part of creation, we learn very much about who we are, what is important, our identity, and why we are here and what our role is in life. That creation helps to guide us to understand ways to well-being, strategies that we need that can support our health and our well-being. And she talks a lot about how our elders have guided us to this work. She shares information related to things like our cultural practices as teaching us around delay of gratification. It acknowledges that in our cultural practices, we actually have a lot of information that talks about the importance of spiritual development. And spiritual development is critical to well-being. She shares that there are many practices that we use, whether it be as social workers or psychologists, like CBT and DBT, but they often don't go far enough. They don't go far enough because they exclude spirit, and we must start with spirit. And when we start with spirit, we are much more likely to find and support those mechanisms that promote well-being at the individual and family and community level. She also talks about how it is that we need to create or challenge systems so that we are centering Indigenous ways of being and doing and knowing as our way forward. Over to you, Holly. Or Alanese, I think, actually. Over to you, Alanese.
I'm just having a bit of a delay here with the PowerPoint. My apologies.
I can give you a hint on the next speaker we're going to talk about.
There.
There he is. And he's not with us today, but he is part of this network. Many of the people that we spoke with are part of this Ontario network. And I just really want to thank you, Dr. Stewart, Etsy, for putting together this dream team, because it's really enriched my research as well as clinical life, being able to interact with your network. And Rod McCormick is somebody that's mentored you. He's mentored me. He's mentored a lot of Indigenous people into the field of psychology. Although he's not doing academic psychology anymore, he did for a number of years. And he does speak about that in terms of his journey and his path, right from being a school counselor in his early days of training from University of Victoria with his master's degree, University of British Columbia with his PhD in counseling psychology. I mean, he talked a lot about all of the different Indigenous communities that he worked with in the past and continues to work with today, one of which being the Secwepemc Nation, located in Kamloops. When he's done work with a group called Knowledge Makers, they publish their own journal. They're an international network of Indigenous health scholars. So his interview is kind of more like a retrospective of his body of work in Indigenous psychology and how it's really evolved into Indigenous research and his approach to doing Indigenous research after coming through all of that very, very specific training that we go through as psychologists, being shaped in a very particular structured way by the field. But then as a result of having that structured experience, knowing how to kind of critique, interrogate it, and make space for Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking within the practice of research in academia. Okay, next slide.
We also had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Chris Musquash. Chris Musquash has quite an extensive bio, and he is, my gosh, I'm not going to remember all of them, and I'm trying to remember them. None of them are coming up. So he works at Lakehead University and continues to support the development of graduate students in the field of psychology with a focus in Indigenous health and mental wellness and addictions. He is also a registered psychologist and continues to practice at the Delico Child and Family Services in the Thunder Bay area. He's a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Mental Health and Addictions, a professor at the Nossum University, as well as in psychology, and he's the director at the Center for Rural and Northern Health Research and an adjunct at Health Sciences at Lakehead University. When we spoke with Chris, Chris really talked to us about sort of understanding how we take information that we have sort of gained as psychologists in our training, and how do we then tease apart those parts that are really critical for us as Indigenous people, those parts around community, around understanding Indigenous worldview, our ways of being and doing and knowing, and how do we not necessarily integrate them, but how do we ensure that they are elevated and they continue to guide and lead us in our work. So you heard in the mashup that came earlier, Chris was talking about the importance of how do we attend to systems where systems have not always treated us well and have led to very significant issues of trust or mistrust by our people, and what we can do as Indigenous psychologists to be advocates for making shifts in policies and systems. Next slide. We also had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Ed Connors and Elder John Rice. Our Elder Deb Denard has worked very closely with these two men. They talked to us about work they're doing in the area of life promotion, and they talked about the shift, the importance of shifting language and working from a strengths-based perspective. Dr. Ed Connors, Tecumseh, is Mohawk from Ganawage First Nation, and John Rice is an elder from Wasauksing First Nation. They talked about work called Feather Carriers. It is a program for life promotion, and they talk about looking at this from the perspective along the four seasons and how to support people to embrace and use strengths-based approach to address what has often been looked at from a deficits and an illness perspective. Next slide.
Okay, we I think scheduled about 25 different meetings to finally nail down an interview with Dr. Amy Bombay. Very productive scholar, produced a lot of really impactful work that she talked about in this episode that was in that crucial space between RCAP and TRC. And this is really research that she was focusing on trauma-induced impacts from residential school experiences. And she was doing the very difficult work of code switching language and knowledge that our people have embodied as a result of our knowing and our eyewitness and our direct experiences of the residential school era, which lasted generations. And she code switched that knowing and that knowledge into interpretable evidence for the field of psychology that they could palatably digest, because I believe that our field wasn't really ready to hear of the sheer extent and the impact that cultural genocide and the policies of cultural genocide and laws that have come from the Indian Act and from the Canadian government, and how that has impacted our bodies and our knowing and the way that we move through Canada as the First Peoples. And so she's trained neuropsychologist. She's a productive scholar. She creates evidence that many people in our field will defer to as empirical evidence or principal evidence that constitutes proof of truth. So I say that this is an important period of time because post TRC, now we have like tens of thousands of hours of survivor testimony and archival evidence, and we have a incontrovertible amount of evidence about the damage that residential schools have perpetrated upon our people and continue to. But she was producing work at a time when Canada was really not wrapping their head around it. So she does talk about that work and the importance of that and how she used psychology as a tool to leverage into Canadians' understanding about what our experience of trauma is.
We're just having such a wonderful time sharing with you all our amazing leaders in this area that we're going to have to speed up a little bit to get through the rest of the content. So I apologize. I won't spend as much time on Dr. Michael Yellowbird. He is a fascinating man. He is faculty social work, University of Manitoba. And really, his research focused on the effects of colonization, methods of decolonization, ancestral health, intermittent fasting, and Indigenous mindfulness and neurodecolonization, mindful decolonization, and the cultural significance of res dogs. So the first part of that podcast, we talk about, what is the role of the res dogs and how they have been helpers in our communities. So I'm just going to pass it on to the last introduction.
And this was a very freeing interview to have with Dr. Etsy Stewart. We got to really name a lot of our hidden knowing. We revealed it to one another in this episode. So I really encourage you to listen to this one. Things that maybe we were too afraid to tell our supervisors or maybe our students, we told to each other. And so you could hear from the sharp critique that Etsy provided and that we showed in the clip. There will be more of that if you listen to this episode. And Etsy, you of course, feel free to speak to this at the end of the webinar.
And so some preliminary findings when we went through, how are we going to capture this content? And what we came to the conclusion was that by looking for themes, as we typically do from a Western perspective, that we would be missing very important components because each interview in itself had very significant findings that were independent. But just some of the main, I guess, thoughts that came to mind was just about the teachings, approaches, worldview, culture, and of course, talking about gaps. And interestingly, the journey of how many became into the field of helpers and, of course, challenges and successes. One example was just even the language with the Cree speakers. I spent some time with late Austin Tatusis, and he would talk about healing in some of the words, and he talked about bimote. So in English, it means walk is walk, it's a verb, but in Cree, bimote means walk, but the translation is more walk with your heart. So he was teaching me to have mental health and wellness and balance, that I needed to be walking with my heart in every relationship. And so these were all throughout our interviews, different types of teachers that many shared from their teachers.
I'm just seeing in the chat that we have 15 minutes left before we can take questions. So I guess that's permission to continue quickly. One of the really great things is the tangible takeaways that each speaker offered. This is just an excerpt from one of my recommendations that I think really connected with also Chris Mushquash's action items. It's like if we really are serious about recovering from trauma and reducing addictions, we got to start with children, the impacts of children, and really addressing those what he called social determinants of health that also need to be culturally informed. Social determinants of health are fairly Western and mainstream, but he had real specific recommendations on how that can be interpreted and applied, particularly for Indigenous children and within Indigenous families. Next slide. Is this mine too? Not sure.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, obviously you can read as well as I can, but I'm going to read this because I thought this was a compelling statement. The means and ends of counseling. I can't remember the title of it. He's talking about one of his articles that he published way back when about some of the underlying beliefs and how problems occur and how we deal with them now in psychology is very culturally encapsulated. And I would say that's still true today. I mean, even the healing process, the role of the healer is different in most Indigenous cultures than in the biomedical Western approach. The healer in the biomedical approach gets the credit. Whereas there's this expression American Indian healers use, hollow bone. Healers, it's simply a hollow bone that the healing flows through them, and they're not the source of the healing. It's between the patient and the creator, that healing process. It's a more humble approach to healing, which really reinforces a lot of the messaging from all of our guests, including Carol Hopkins. Eventually, we're going to have our own therapeutic approaches. We did for thousands of years, largely ceremonial, and those are being reclaimed, but we're struggling and there's not as many people working on uniquely Indigenous approaches. There is in research, but we're not seeing it as much in therapy yet. Next slide.
So there was a lot of discussion about the importance of attending to culture to address trauma. Carol Hopkins and many of those that we talked to really came back time and time again to the importance of culture and how culture is really our pathways to health and well-being. You can see from this slide that Carol talks a lot about how it's important to participate in culturally based practices, and that over time, as a result of colonization, that was removed from us. And the reconnection to culture is also about a reconnection to health and well-being. And so she talks here about how ceremonial practices like fasting is an important ceremony at the adolescent stage of life. And those rites of passage support different learning and help with managing things like delay of gratification, understanding sort of your role in systems, whether that be family systems, community systems, or otherwise. And what I like here is she talks about, just like Erickson has developmental stages of psychological development, we also have teachings about what's absolutely necessary to facilitate spiritual wellness and growth and development across the life stages. And this, resonates with what we know that Erickson also, stole from the Blackfoot people, and that those practices, the things that even in Western-based understanding have come from a very tribal, community-based practice of what comes from our communities, but they've often removed spirit, and that when we bring spirit back, it attends better to health and well-being. Next slide. We also heard in all of these conversations the challenge, and challenges often have occurred as a result of gaps in systems and services and practices and even policy. So Chris here talks a lot about how the existing information we have about our families and our communities is very much from that deficit-based approach and about all of the problems that we have in our communities. It doesn't always talk about things from a strengths-based approach, but that when we begin to think about and understand those gaps in services and the challenges, we begin to understand why we see the challenges in our community, that we have difficulty overcoming them. It's not because we don't have the answers, but it's because we do not have access to what we need, whether that's access to funding to have the programs and services we need, whether we have access to our Indigenous knowledge and practices, whether we have access to a system that recognizes and values Indigenous knowledge and practices, and that all of those things create crisis in the community. And as a result, it perpetuates the ongoing challenges that we experience. So it's not the fact that we don't know what to do, it's rather that we are not getting the investments we need in order to do the work that creation and creator and our ancestors have laid out for us. Next slide.
It was also really an interesting theme is that many of those who became psychologists or social workers was that they actually started doing this very early in being little people, very young people drawn into the profession, either by relatives, home situations, or events that happened. Some of them, John here particularly talked about kind of being like a natural born mediator, as a little person and growing up. And those were shared with the different psychologists that we interviewed, like that their whole life really was based on this. So like they were kind of born to do this work and felt that, I don't want to say calling, but that pull in this area.
Was this mine to do?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, it feels so weird to mouth these words with Etsy in the webinar. But now you get to hear how we talk about you as if you're not here, but we are also acknowledging that you're here. So here's a quote from your interview. "We have come some ways in the last 25 years, but nowhere near enough of what we need. We need help to build the critical mass of Indigenous people who are training in mental health, all the different disciplines." And I really thank the Ontario NEIHR for facilitating this. This has been my experience of being somebody who's participating in this network. Ideally, of course, because I still love psychology and I still very passionate about the practice of clinical psychology and counseling psychology, I feel that the gap is really around creating a safe place for our people to train and to practice in counseling and clinical psychology, because there's only a handful of Indigenous people who are the leaders in this, who some of them are still the ones who were the leader of this. And when I was a student 25 years ago, and I couldn't agree more. Next slide.
I'm not, I
Oh,
think that
me
you,
again.
Yes,
Me
that's
again.
you. Yep.
I don't normally get back-to-back slides. Okay. Quote from Dr. Nelson. One of my bigger successes is working with one small community in the interior of BC. I was invited in this work with community members. It wasn't well communicated to the community. I don't know if any of you have had that experience of arriving at a community and they don't know why you're here. This is what happened to Dr. Nelson. Um, so when we were inviting community members, share who we are and what we were doing and why we were there, we were going to hold a community feast, and only one person came. One parent came, even though we were asked to come and work with dozens of families, but only one came. And so fair enough. There was a moment of realization where we realized that we weren't actually invited by the community. Otherwise, they would have come. So we found out what actually happened, and then we shifted our approach. So we actually went door to door with bags of sage and little bits of food, bags of apple or whatever it was, tiny gifts, bookmarks, pens, things like that. And we went and asked if they would come to a feast, and we hired the best community chef, and we said, so and so is going to be cooking. And a lot of the time people were like, oh, okay, well, if she's cooking, then I'm going to come. Different strategy, community engagement.
definitely. So it's all about connecting with the community people in those truly authentic ways. When we were putting this together, I was just looking on Apple and some of the comments. And so I just put two in here that were some comments. Basically, when Indigenous healing, I've always found psychology and the root causes of behavior. What I find rewarding is that our ways of thinking and doing, culture, will be the grounding force of our trauma healing. So she said, as I've listened diligently from each episode, has only strengthened my vision that we'll find healing from toxin insights just as this and translate this into our language and day-to-day living. Thank you for bringing, all our brothers and sisters together and teach me better ways of doing. So I just wanted to share that, just that's some feedback that was on the internet regarding our podcasts. And we'd like to, of course, acknowledge that this is the Ontario NEIHR and all the NEIHRs across Canada are funded by CHR, and that Dr. Suzanne Etsy Stewart is actually the PI and the brain person behind writing the grant and bringing us the Ontario NEIHR, and that we're just one of the sub-themes. And of course, to acknowledge that PIHTIKWE was produced season 1 by David McGuffin. And of course, the amazing music was performed by Fawn Wood, who is an award-winning Cree Salish musician and songwriter, and some information about her. So I'm going to remove the screen share so we can see faces, and we may have a few minutes for some questions or comments. I'm not sure, and that this is
Does
something.
anyone, if there's any people out there who have any questions that haven't already been submitted, please, this would be a great time to write them in the Q&A. We would love to ask them, and maybe while we're waiting for that, I will ask a question. So it's a little overwhelming to hear my clip, for one thing. I hate the sound of my voice, and secondly, all the nice things that you guys are saying about me, that's very kind. And the network is like a child. It takes a village to create it and to nurture it and raise it. So we all have gotten here together. So I appreciate that acknowledgement. And I just want to say, from your perspective, what have been some of the high points and the challenges of doing this project? Because this is a massive project. Like, this whole project is like a coup itself in Indigenous psychology, let alone like the actual bits of data and strong information that came from it. But the actual project itself has been amazing. I mean, you could have a whole podcast just to talk about what it was like to make the podcast.
Yeah, I think for me, some of the high points was how when we started talking to people, many of us had very similar ideas and beliefs about that our identity as Indigenous people came first, and that is what guides and leads us. And I think it was Holly that said, being an Indigenous person, we're most concerned about caring for community first, and the who we are as a psychologist is often second. And hearing that, those comments about it's humbling, that Rod's comment about it's a humbling approach, that I think we all felt that, we're not the experts, we're not the leads. And I think we all feel that, like you said right now, Etsy, it's like it feels weird to hear you talking and all the kind words. It's like I'm just doing what I've learned or what has been taught to me. Like I'm no expert. I'm just simply sharing the teachings that I've gotten. So I think that's been a highlight for me. I think the challenge or the tough part of it has been that we all agree that until Canada and the systems that support Canada change, our people will continue to suffer. For me, that was what I heard.
Mhm.
Amazing. And Dr. Ferguson and Graham, do you have anything else that you want to add?
I don't think I'll add to that. I'm probably going to address the question in the Q&A.
Okay,
Did you
great.
want to add something to that, Dr. Ferguson, before?
I can add to it. I remember, I think I was listening to a podcast series, and it was a series of recorded lectures from, it was a conference at USask, I believe, or maybe it was First Nations University of Canada. And I thought, how brilliant. It was like I could attend this conference and listen to all these really exceptional Indigenous scholars speak on education. What would it be like if we could talk to other Indigenous psychologists about our own field of practice? And then so we adopted the model of lodge visits. So back in the day, we used to know how to like knock on the door and have a real face-to-face visit, sit, share tea. And the quality of those conversations would be quite different than if we were doing kind of a stand and deliver in an academic setting. So I said, but what do you say when you enter a lodge? We say beamed again, welcome, come on in. And then Holly said, well, we say PIHTIKWE and Cree, and there's way more Cree speakers than Ojibwe speakers. So we ended up with the word PIHTIKWE. But that really, it's the same meaning. It's the same thing. And I think it fits for a lot of us from all over Turtle Island is we want to visit each other. We want to have those conversations, and we want to be free from a lot of the constraints that limit our voice. And because we self-silence a lot in the field of psychology, we do, especially around the topic of spirituality. And I tried to answer a really, really good question in the chat, but in a short time frame. But there's a deep scholarship. You can have a PhD level of scholarship, as we know from Dr. Carol Hopkins, in this kind of, and it's lifelong and it's intergenerational. This deep knowing and this deep information. So we were just trying to tap into that with our visits. And yeah, the visits happened over Riverside and Zoom, and we had technical people there, and we had, help with microphones. And I too was cringing at the sound of my voice. I wanted to stop after episode 1. It's like, you all take this on. I can't. I sound like Adam Sandler in The Waterboy. I thought in my first episode, like, I'm not doing this anymore.
No,
but then I got over the shame, of it. And then I realized, that this is also indicative of what we carry as a result of being silenced in our disciplines. Like, we don't even like the sound of our own voice anymore. So we really have to act opposite, as Marshall Linehan would say, and regulate that shame emotion that is inappropriate.
Yep. And you got a better microphone and you felt 100 times better is what I remember, Alanise.
Yeah, but we all had to encourage each other because it felt a little bit vulnerable, actually, even doing these interviews and putting it out there. I just want to quickly respond to the one question about placing spirituality above psychiatry. We're not replacing anything. We're saying like we need to combine both knowledge systems. But the teachings I've had in terms of spirituality from a Cree speaker, Jeff Wastesakut, is that when we're born with a chak, which is the spirit, Miwa, the body, and with Tipawan, that's the mind, and also Pawagan, our spirit helper. And so how he's described it is when someone is using substances, we'll say, for example, alcohol or any other substance, is that the spirit helper, Pawagan, leaves the body. and that it comes back when the person no longer has those substances. And that's what ceremony helps, is to bring that back and to acknowledge and honor that we're born with a spirit helper. So that's why it's balancing spirit first before Western or psychiatry looks at CBT, which is balancing the mind first. So that's just one teaching I've had regarding that. And I don't know if how Dr. Ferguson or Dr. Rastul want to respond to that as well.
Yeah, I saw that question too, and it is a really big question. And I would tend to agree with you that it's not necessarily one over the other, but I think an acknowledgement that spirit has been removed from so much of many parts of our daily living. We don't talk about that. That's not what we do in psychology. We're just supposed to talk about behaviors and actions and and our emotions, but we're not supposed to talk about spirit. And but spirit often is our guide. And I think that when we have key questions answered that come from teachings like the creation story, that helps us to understand and place ourselves within a framework that creator has for us, that allows us to think about what gives us hope, what gives us a sense of purpose, what gives us a sense of meaning, what gives us a sense of belonging. So like, why are we here? Who are we? Why are we here? And what's our purpose in life? Those are spirit-based questions. They're not questions of emotion or physical. They are intended to help situate ourselves in a space. And I think when we bring spirit back, it gives people that sense of hope, and they can see themselves and where they need to go. So I think psychiatry is often very deficits based and very much around thinking about how do we solve an individual problem. But spirit is not just about a person, it's also about our connection and who we are in that greater framework of creation, and helping us to understand that what we do has impacts for those around us in today, but also generations ahead, and what somebody did generations back has impacted us. I come from the Robinson-Huron Treaty, and many of you are aware that we have settled a large land claim. We got that money because our ancestors were very smart, and they made some decisions that allowed us to now be able to move forward in a way that can improve our quality of life. But we also now have a responsibility to take that large settlement and make sure that it's there for generations to come. It's those kinds of things that are spirit-based decisions and not emotional or mental or physical decisions.
Thank you so much. We're right at time right now, and I feel like that was the perfect ending. I feel like there's so much more that we want to discuss and share. So thank you so much. The contact information for the presenters will be listed somewhere. Where will it see? This is
I
why
can
I don't
send.
know what.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. I can send that out when I send the recording.
Okay, yeah. So are people okay to email you guys with any questions or comments? And we'll invite Dr. Deb to say any spiritual conclusions that she'd like to make, and to do the spiritual closing.
My gosh, wow. I think the main thing in terms of thinking about connecting to spirit and being able to center that, I like that word. I was thinking